Blast off. There we are. Blasting off with the great and powerful Ben Shear again. So I must have done something right that you agreed to come back on, because I didn't pay you to do it. So I'm assuming that you had fun the first time, and everybody liked your episode, of course, and happy to have you back. So thanks for
I
coming on, Ben.
appreciate it. You just haven't received my invoice yet.
But before we get into the meat and potatoes on all the training things, one thing, and not to sideswipe it all, but I know that you're traveling West Coast with your guys and working on and keeping them healthy. I just wanted to ask, because everybody out in the golfing public always wants to know kind of behind the curtain what it's like on tour. So can you just give a brief description of what it's like on, especially early in the year, as guys are getting ramped up for the season, what a day looks like between you and one of the tour pros? Or
Yeah,
what
so
a week looks like.
think,
Maybe I should say that.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing is usually, hopefully, your players have done a good job in the off season, and you've all worked together and worked hard, and you come into this part of the season with both your game and your body feeling good. Right now, the hard part you start saying is, okay, now we got this macro and micro view. We need to start looking at the season. So one is, how do we get off to a good start, which obviously as a player is massive. You know, potentially you play well. If you weren't in the elevated, you can get in the elevated through all the swing fives and aeons and all that. I can't even keep track of all those different things, right? So if you could get out of the gate early, there's a lot of obviously value to that. And a lot of time guys feel good. Their energy is good. Their body feels good. Their swing is good, right? And the other part of it is, whether we get out of the gate really strong early or not, how do we actually maintain feeling this way throughout a long season with a very short off season, right? So there's, you kind of always have to be looking at, hey, we're playing right now this week. How do we perform? And then also, what's our long-term cost of the work we do this week or don't do this week, let's say, right? So, my general thing with my guys is, you'll see people at times feel like, oh, well, I work so hard in the off season. Now in the gym, I can just kind of do some quote easy stuff and I'm good, right? Or maintenance, whatever that quote means, right? I'm not sure what maintenance means, because if you have real maintenance to maintain a high level of fitness, you're going to have to do some hard work to maintain that. You can't do a low level of work and maintain the level of fitness you have that you got to by doing hard work, right? So, a big part is getting the guys to realize that, hey, we might not have the same volume of high intensity work that we did in the off season, but we are going to need to put some of that in there, right? I tell the guys all the time, I'm like, look, we can't just down regulate everything we do all the time, because it's like if I said to you, hey, I take you on as a new client, Pete, and the first day I'm like, hey, let's just, do a plank, and you do a plank for 30 seconds and you're shaking and it's hard, but you're able to keep proper alignments. You're like, wow, that was a great workout. Well, if a year later I still have you doing the same 30-second plank, it's not doing anything, right? So it's like, we need to actually have enough stimulus with intensity to actually maintain our fitness throughout the year. So obviously we're not going to try to do that every day of the week. Maybe the volume is lower. So usually for us, it's on a Monday or a Tuesday, depending on when travel day occurs. We need to have like a real workout day, like where we get after it kind of hard, right? Where we're kind of working at the same intensity we did in the off season. But we know, let's say we do it on a Monday, we know we're not playing till Thursday. And we've been doing it all summer. So our body is used to, all summer. This is not hockey. This is golf. All winter, right? We've been doing it all winter, so our body's adapted to doing the high intensity work. So it's not like it's going to like have me so super sore and broken down just by doing it. Something we've been doing for a long time at this point. So on a Monday, we want to kind of crush it, and we want to really push the intensity. That allows us to truly maintain our level of fitness. Then as the week goes on, we may have to be ramping some things down. We may still do some hard work, but we may go do something to say, hey, we're going to do one set really hard, right? So typically for my guys, Monday's a big day. Tuesday, we're generally doing kind of more mobility, stability, movement-based training. It could have some speed, it could have some med balls, it could have some core work, that kind of stuff. And then we get into when the tournament starts, usually our day that we tee off early on Thursday or Friday, our early day is a workout day also, right? Because let's just say I go early, late on the Thursday after my round, I may go practice or do whatever else, but I'm going to go to the gym Thursday after. And we may take that high intensity thing and bring our loads down 10%. Maybe instead of doing 3 sets, we're doing 2 sets, whatever. So we're still challenging the system, but not wearing it down, because obviously now energy management for the next couple days to compete becomes an important thing. So if I'm actually making them too sore or over fatiguing them or whatever, then I'm not helping in the micro part of it, like for the this week component. Even though macro wise, hey man, we're doing a lot of hard strength stuff, that's going to help us sustain it longer, right? So I have to manage the micro in that moment, which is, hey, I need to do enough work so I'm not killing me on the macro level, but I also need to perform right here, right now, this today, right? So then Friday, I'm going to get up in the morning. I'm going to have a warm up. Understand that these guys warm up for depending on the player, somewhere between 30 to 60 minutes in the gym. I mean, some of these guys' warm ups are workouts. The intensity might not be, like you're doing 1 rep max, super explosive, whatever. You might do a couple jumps or something just to stimulate the nervous system as part of your warm up, but you're not over fatiguing the nervous system. But you are doing enough work that it's like, I kind of stimulated the system. I got the muscles active. I got things going. I got the blood flow. So, then you're kind of saying, okay, my warm ups now Thursday through Saturday, other than the day that I played early, are going to be kind of mini workouts, let's call them, right? So I'm helping kind of maintain my long, so I'm not getting a loss. And then depending on, if a guy, depending on the player as well, some of the players, if they're playing well, and let's just say on a Saturday or Sunday, they have a late tee time, they get stir crazy sitting in their room until 2:00 in the afternoon. So I'll have those guys come in and say, hey, why don't you meet me at 9:30, 10 a.m. We'll do some movement-based training. We'll do some med ball work. We'll do some core work, like to kill time, but also get a little bit of training in at the same time. So now let's say they meet me at 10. They have a 2:00 tee time. So 1:00, they're going to be on the range. 12:30, they're going to be having lunch. So if I meet them at 10 and we go 10 to 11, by the time they get out of there, they shower, they change, they get back and forth to the course. It's like they didn't sit around in the room just like getting themselves all wound up, just waiting to get to the course. So, there's a lot of ways you can start using your training to fill voids, do other things that might be mentally good for them, have them not getting restless. Each player's got its little bit of his own formula, but just think like hard early week, reasonably hard on your early day, and then kind of warm up and potentially early morning stuff pre-round as kind of low level fitness work. But that's just helping kind of, I call those making deposits in the bank, right? It's like, hey, if we just do enough of these over time, it's like if you had a compounding interest in your bank account and you put $10 in a week over time, there's a lot of money in your bank, right? So I tell my guys like, hey, look, we're going to go make a deposit today. I'm not looking to work you so hard that we're withdrawing from the bank. We're depositing in the bank today, right? Sometimes we make a withdrawal so we can invest in something else, right? We're going to make a withdrawal because we're going to work so hard, but it's going to give us a bigger return later, right? It's an investment in something later. Some are deposits and some are investments, I think is how I like to think about it. Right? The small ones are deposits and the other ones are investments. They cost you something, but they give you a return down the road. Right? So you're trying to balance that. And different players have different senses of how they want to feel and all of that stuff, right? It's all an N of one project when you do this, because some guys love to feel super taut when they're playing. Like they don't actually want to feel loose. Like we have this perception that guys want to play loose. What I would tell you is most tour players that I've ever worked with actually don't like that, because they feel like they can't control the club face properly. When they feel a little bit taut, and taut is different than tight. Taut, like their muscles are engaged.
Yeah,
they feel like they have better control of the club face. So I have a lot of players over the years who like, when I get them away from doing so much kind of feeling loose and feeling a little more taut, they're like, wow, I actually felt like I swung it way better doing it.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, there you go, everybody. So there's a look at what a tour level trainer does with his players during tournament week and in the early part of the season. Last time you were on, we talked a lot about strength training, and not only strength training, but how to differentiate between when somebody should do training with not just for force and mass movement, but also for velocity. And you dial in on that exceptionally well. You have the ability to measure and adjust somebody's program accordingly. But one thing that I ran out of time with that I'd like to get in today is the flexibility aspect. And portion of that would be, as I looked at this a little more, where this comes from is I obviously have a very curious mind, or I wouldn't have a podcast called 360 that talks about a lot of different things associated with golf. But as I look across social media and different things that are becoming more prevalent, at least from in the training world, not necessarily golf specific, but I would say this relates to golf in some shape or form, because flexibility, a lot of people say you got to have flexibility to play golf. Well, yeah, you do. You got a range of motion, mobility, and strength. But the full range of motion type flexibility that you see some of these trainers are putting out on Instagram, even Twitter, where they're doing massive, or they're doing heavy loaded stretching, like a Jefferson curl with 135-pound bar, where they're standing on a box, so they're getting maximum stretch. And then I would even break that down into, if you haven't had an injury and doing stretches like that versus if you had an injury, because now you can destabilize a joint or the body in some way, shape, or form, and now the body's going to retract and you're going to be out of playing for a while. So I know that's a lot on a big topic. I'd like to just jump into flexibility, because one thing that I know that you're when you do like bench press with some of your players, whether it's golf or it's hockey, you're not having them do full range of motion where the bar or the dumbbells come all the way down to chest level. You're only going where the elbows would reach shoulder level on the eccentric portion. Where does flexibility play a role as far as getting full ranges of motion of a joint flexibility versus partial ranges of motion as it relates to golf?
I think you always have to kind of look at, what's your risk reward in everything that you do, right? In sports performance, what we do puts more stress on people's body than almost anything. I mean, obviously taking thousands of golf swings a week is also a massive stretch, and probably even higher. But generally speaking, we're making people move fast. We're putting them under big loads. We're doing a bunch of stuff, which can be fantastic or also can be terrible, unfortunately, right? So you're trying to say, what's the risk reward of everything that I do? Like, I'll use the bench press example. Why I like to floor press or something with dumbbells is like, I understand that if I get deeper in that, I get a bigger pec stretch, I'm going to get more hypertrophy. So my muscles are going to grow more. Well, if I'm working with a bodybuilder, my risk reward might say, hey, if I don't grow more in my pecs, I have no chance of competing in this bodybuilding competition. So in that example, that might be real important. Well, for a golfer, on the other hand, I say, well, is big pecs important to being a good golfer, or is just having a strong chest probably have some value to being a good golfer? And the answer is having a strong chest is value, because the pecs function is to cross the arms across midline. Pecs are really important. For a long time, people said chest wasn't important for golf, which is the most ridiculous statement anybody ever said, because pecs are one of the muscles that fires the most in the golf swing. So, and if you actually measure it throughout the entire swing, I think it might even be the most. So pecs are important, but am I going to risk my shoulder health by getting so deep and putting that stretch in to get it when muscular growth is not the primary objective? No, that's insane, right? So there's just a simple example of, hey, what's my goal with this person? Play better golf in this example versus have bigger pecs, right? So the same exercise, but I might look at it and train it differently based on the person I'm specifically working with, right? So in golfers, do no harm should be your driving principle, right? Like, if you're a trainer, your goal, never mind, obviously you're trying to make everybody perform at a higher level, but your first goal better be do no harm. Mm-hmm. Because, most of these guys, if you're playing on tour, you're kind of like 98, 99% perfect to start with if you're able to perform at that level. So the odds of messing them up are actually pretty good, right? So would I do something like a Jefferson curl, which is kind of like an RDL with a rounded back and straight legs under big load? And, like you said, these people are standing up on boxes. They got their hands 10 inches below their feet. No, never. I'm never going to do that. What is that doing from a benefits perspective that outweighs the risk that it takes? Are there people who get away with it? Of course there are. There are outliers for everything. And I'm not saying that it inherently is going to go bad. I don't know that, right? No one can tell you for sure if you do this exercise, you're going to get hurt. And for sure, if you do this one, you're not going to get hurt, right? We're always playing the odds, right? So, and then you got to say, well, even if it works out well, what's my benefit? And if there's another way to approach that same benefit at lower risk, why wouldn't I take that opportunity to do it, right? So I think we also have to separate mobility and flexibility as kind of two different things, right? I think we use those terms interchangeably. To me, flexibility is like if I put you on a treatment table or you're laying on the ground and your trainer's stretching you out, how much passive range of motion do you have around a joint? How much can someone move your joints in different directions, right? So I think about that as your flexibility. Mobility, I look at a much more dynamic thing, and it's what range of motions do you have actively? What can you on your own, standing up with your 2 feet on the ground, how much range of motion can you display? And often those things are very, very different, right? And the thing that often links those two, or is the different why they're so different, and they should be slightly different. About 10% is probably the normal range, active versus passive, right? You're going to probably have about 10% more range of motion passively than you will actively. But as soon as that gap gets wider than that, there's usually a stability component that comes in. I'm a stability guy. I've always been a stability guy. I mean, I did Greg Roscoff's MAT internship years ago. I'm involved with Redcord and a bunch of other stability models. And, it's my strong belief that oftentimes tightness is the body's protective mechanism against instability, right? I give this example all the time, which is like, hey, Pete, you and I are going to have a sprinting race and we're going to sprint, right? And from the first 10 yards, we're going to be on the grass. But at 10 yards, we're going to hit ice. And you're going to run that 10-yard fluid. Everything's going to be moving, big range of motion. And the minute you get to that ice, your brain is going to shut you right down. And you're going to have little tiny baby movements. And you're going to look like the stiffest guy in the world trying to run on ice. Because your body senses the instability of the ice. And it takes away the range. Because it knows that if it gives you big range, you're going to fall and hurt yourself. Right? It's a simple concept, right? If you go up to any person you've ever met in your life, and you never tell them anything, and you pretend you're going to punch them in the stomach, and you don't give them any warning, and just totally out of the blue, they will brace up reflexively without you ever having warned them. The body is designed to protect itself. That's what it does best. We are designed to survive and protect, right? So if the body feels like I can be in this joint position safely, it will give me range of motion there. If it says, I'm getting into a range of motion where I become unstable and I'm going to potentially injure myself from here, I'm going to take that range of motion away from you. So oftentimes the cure to the thing is not, quote, stretching. The cure comes from building stability around that specific joint. And I'm not saying you never stretch. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. There are times I do. I do have some players, very few over the years, but I have had players. I have one now who's actually tight, like tissue quality is tight, joint capsules are tight, and needs to do some flexibility. The thing about those things is I would tell you is that you got to hold those stretches way longer than you think. This whole like 20 to 30-second thing, like no chance. You got to be there for minutes, right? I mean, if you talk to the guys at Egoscue, they would tell you half an hour. Right? You should hold your stretch for like a half an hour to down regulate the nervous system and all of that stuff, to let the tissues actually let go and do some of that stuff. And you got to be really consistent for a long time to make stuff change. Like, I mean, I have one guy, his hips are really tight. I mean, it took us legitimately doing some basic hip stretching work 2 years. I mean, doing it 4 times a week, holding for a long time to really make change that lasted and stuck. Not, oh, I stretch, I feel better, I get up, oh, that's really good, and you come back tomorrow and you're right back to where you were. I mean, to truly change what you're doing is a big production and takes stuff. Do I think that you can do some foam rolling and bring some good blood to the area before you do your stability work? Sure. Do I think you can do some like using bands and stuff like that and just do some joint mobilizations before you do certain things to kind of just reposition the joint or create some joint space without stretching? That also can help in some of the stuff. I do. I think those things are great. I love a little soft self-myofascial release, a little banded mobilization, and then a little activation or stability work to lock it in place. I mean, unless you have these true significant tissue restrictions, which on the tour level is actually less common than in the general population, obviously.
First time I was aware of that was watching an old video of you when Allie Gilbert had you down to do a talk at one of her seminars.
Westchester Country Club, probably
Yes.
10 years ago at least.
And it was eye-opening for me. is one of the guys got up there and said that he had tight hamstrings, and you asked him, how long have you been stretching? He said, about 11 to 12 months. And he said, well, you don't have tight hamstrings and you got a joint stability issue. And within 5 minutes or less, you had him able to reach down and go beyond just touching his toes. And you said, you've got to, I don't remember, it was his hip or his low back, whatever it was, but you were able to get him to do that. And for me, who had always been told that he was tight with the, the injuries I've had, I'm like, that was a light bulb that went off for me to say, okay, I've been stretching for how long? 30 minutes a day or an hour a day sometimes. And I'm not getting the range of motion or the mobility that I
So
should.
that presentation I did it for a long time, a couple times, different places. I did it at one of the World Golf Fitness Summits, something called "Why Am I Tight?" Right, and the reality of that test is, I always start that talk. I love when I'm giving a presentation to kind of ask a question to start the talk. Hey, how many people in the room think they're tight? And every single person in the room raises their hand, even if they're not tight, right? Everybody feels like they're tight. Even like women in yoga think they're tight, right? Because well, when you hit end range, even though you're 30 degrees beyond normative data on what end range is, it feels tight. So everybody has this perception of tightness, right? But the question is, do you actually have proper range of motion is more the question than do you have this feeling of tightness, right? But I always say, how many people feel tight, right? And then I say, okay, now leave up your hands if you've been doing foam rolling, stretching, 6 months, a year. There's people holding their hand up 10 years. And it's like, well, guess what? If you've been doing all that work for 10 years, probably not the problem if it hasn't improved. There's a reason it's not getting better. You're just not dealing with the reality. But we've all been taught stretch, do this, do that, and as like the magic cures for everything. And the reality is it can help for certain things, but oftentimes that's not the issue.
So it is with I don't want to say recommendation, because as we've talked enough that there's so many different things for so many different people. But if we can speak generically a little bit, I know at someone at your level, generically is a terrible thing to do, because you deal with you're able to fine tune people so well, and some of the best athletes on the planet. But it just as far as mobility, I always refer to that as active stretching, moving range of motion with the engagement of the muscle or the musculature itself. Is something like active or stretching or mobilization work would be more recommended to more people than just simply static stretching, stretching your hamstring or trying to touch your toes? Or
I don't think, if your problem is a stability problem, active stretching isn't going to cure it either. Right? You may see the difference between the active and passive be greater than that 10%, like we talked about. But I don't think by doing a dynamic warm up or something like that, all of a sudden magically you're going to become more mobile. Right? I think you still need to identify what is the underlying problem. Is it a joint capsule problem? Is it a tissue length problem? Is it a joint centration problem? Is it an instability problem? Like, what is the actual issue? And then you need to go address the specific issue to try to fix it, right? And then also, is it coming from where you think it's coming from? Also, right? My hip is tight, well, but my foot doesn't function, or whatever the case may be. We also have to start looking up and down chains and say, well, does that move that way because the joint above or below isn't functioning? And if, or anywhere up the chain, maybe not just above or below, it could be way further away, but as long as there's an interrelationship, whether it be fascially or however they're connected, right? Kinetic chains, whatever it is, right? You might find if there's a problem anywhere in that chain, anatomy trains, if you want to talk about fascial, however you want to talk about it, if there's a problem anywhere in that chain and it's not functioning, the body will probably compensate somewhere up the line to protect against that problem. And so maybe the problem is not your hip, it's your ankle. And if you don't fix your ankle, your hip's never going to get better, right? Or vice versa, right? I kind of think about like the lower body as like a suspension bridge, right? I tell people, I'm like, because people, there's always the people who say, oh, it's all hip driven. And then the other people will say it's ground up, right? Because that's where you hit the ground first. And both those arguments sound really good. But I don't know that anybody really can tell you definitively which way it is. So I kind of say, oh, if I looked at the lower body as like a suspension bridge, and like think about your feet as the foundation of the suspension bridge that's down into the ground, and think about your hips as like the top where the guy wires are holding everything up, right? Either way, if I chop out the ankles and feet because they're not working, if I broke the foundation of my bridge, everything up top would come collapsing down. So now everything's hanging on those guy wires, right? So now the hip is what's holding on, and you're like, oh man, I got this big hip problem, right? Vice versa, if I cut the guy wires at the top and they came crashing down on the foundation, well, now all of a sudden I got a massive ankle problem because everything's crushed down on top of it. Right. So you got to start figuring out where some of this stuff is coming from. And it's not always as simple as it's just what's sitting in front of your face. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think that's an easy way to think about the lower body piece of it. Right. Kind of you think ground up or hip down or hip out, pelvis out, core out, whatever words you like to use. I don't care. But, often we have people in camps. They always think it's hip driven or they always think it's foot and ankle driven. And I'm going to tell you, having done this a long time, yes, sometimes. Sometimes it's one, sometimes I don't know, right? So I want to just look at the whole system and then say, okay, for you, let's fix A first and see what happens and then go from there, right? We can't, there's never a one size fits all solution for any of this stuff. You have to know how to look properly. And that's, the diagnostic piece of our business is actually one of the hardest parts to get right. There's tons of systems out there and, they often pick up the low-hanging fruit that exists because there's a lot of commonalities and stuff. So they do a really good job at looking at some basic stuff, which is great. But when it doesn't just, when you do your basic usual, hip mobility, blah, 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 and then all of a sudden they're not better, well, now what do you do? Right? Mm-hmm. It's not always that simple. And while that might work for a decent percentage of the population, it doesn't work for everybody. And, if you're truly skilled at your craft, A, you either have to have more tools than that, or B, at worst case, build yourself a network of other great professionals that you can send them out to and say, hey, look, I did my movement assessment, FMS, TPI, whatever you're doing, right? And say, I've done, all the corrective exercises for that, but they're still not functioning right. Hey, can you take a little bit of a deeper dive for me and see what you can find? But I've done, the hip 90-90, I've done the, whatever I've done, right? That are kind of the more traditional approaches that we take that are solving the normative issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And at least if somebody has done those things, the basics, then you have it. If someone comes to you and says, look, Ben, I've been doing the pigeon stretch or the 90-90 and trying to get my hips, and I've been doing this for some time, at least you can say, okay, we know that that's not the problem. That the tightness there from stretching is not the problem. So it's not like you're wasting your time.
All information is good, whether it helped or not, right? Everything is helpful.
Assuming somebody does have a flexibility, let's dive in a little bit more into flexibility and stretching, whether they're doing active and weighted stretching, or they're just doing, a 60 to 120 second hold. Does stretching require time in between to allow the soft tissue to adapt the same way that working a bench press or working a squat or deadlift would require time to allow the muscle and tissue to recover? Or can somebody stretch with impunity or every day for half an hour the same stretch series?
I think you can stretch every day the same stuff because you're not tearing any fibers down, right? So it's nothing that has to be rebuilt. And I think part of it is you're basically trying to, at some level, reposition the joint so you have better length tension relationships, right? We have most joints have, and bones have multiple muscles and things attaching into similar parts of the body, right? So you have different muscles pulling in different directions and doing different things. And we call it joint centration, right? So if you just think about like your hip, your acetabulum, like a ball attached to the side of your hip, and then think about like your femur as this ball. Is that ball sitting in the center? Is it pushed way up against the edge of the bowl, the top of the bowl, the bottom of the bowl, the back of the bowl, whatever? So something is short and there's some length tension relationship of some of the muscles that's pulling it out of the center, right? So if the ball is not sitting in the center of the bowl, it's not going to spin around the bowl freely. Like if I want to just spin that ball, if it's jammed up against the edge, it's not going to move freely. So partly what you're trying to do is get the joint in proper position, right? So then you can start working and doing your stuff from a called neutral centrated position, which allows you to start making real change. So if you need to stretch certain tissues to get it centrated, A, you want to do it frequently so it's there more often, and B, the brain starts recognizing that position as a good position, right? Like your brain gets comfortable. We have what's, it's called homeostasis, right? Wherever you are, your body gets really good at being where you are, right? It's like losing weight. Like, you people could do all this stuff, and it's like their weight kind of keeps pulling back to those same numbers. They kind of lose a bit and they go back. It's like your body got comfortable at whatever it is, 205, whatever your number is, right? And it's like it needs to get comfortable in a new homeostasis. And to change homeostasis takes time and repetition. So what you got to do is you got to do it frequently enough where the brain's like, oh, I've actually been here a lot and I actually kind of like it here. So let me let some of this stuff go and let me hold this position because this is better for it, right? And obviously that's a very oversimplistic way of talking about it. It's a complicated system, but I think that's an important idea that your body will always go back to homeostasis. And fighting homeostasis is a little bit of a give and take, tug and pull kind of battle that you're in. So the more frequently you can be in those good positions, assuming what you're doing to get there is not ripping muscles, tearing fibers, doing all those kind of damage things that need true time to repair, you're better off with high frequency.
As far as the how to stretch, is it better to say you've already identified, longer hold times, minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, the Gosky, as you said, there
30 minutes, an hour.
30 minutes. Yeah, that's crazy. I remember reading that for the first time decades ago, but
look, that's why it's not popular, but it actually works great, to be honest. It really works very well.
What about the differences between holding a position of stretch or moving through that stretch? So let's say if somebody's going to stretch their hips and they're going to put their leg, let's say they're going to put the bench at 30 degrees and they're going to, because they can't get their knee to the ground if it's flat to the ground. So they're going to have the knee is going to be lifted. So that the shin is at the 30 degree.
Oh, you're doing like a standing pigeon.
Yes.
Okay.
So there would be the position where they bend the hinge from the hips and they bend forward and then they hold that position for, let's say, 2 minutes. Is that better than moving slowly up and down an active movement to stretch that area? Or is it better to combine, do one set of 2 minutes at the hold and then another of, let's say, 20 repetitions moving through that motion? Is there one that's better than the other?
So for me, being a stability guy, I still, even within my stretch, I want to find a way to create a stability component to it. So in that example, if I'm using this bench to do my kind of elevated pigeon, we call that, right? I would still I would hold the position and I would have the person actively driving the knee and that shin down into the bench while they're there. They're not just in that position and flexing forward in the sagittal plane. I would want them to actively be externally rotating that hip and driving the leg down and into the bench. Because I am getting the lengthening of the tissues from the stretch perspective, but now I'm actually attacking the muscle spindle, which is a part of the stability side of the continuum. Mm-hmm. So now I'm hitting it from both sides. And I'm basically using now isometrics, right, to create stability to move. So just like I was saying about the homeostasis and getting frequency and getting the body used to being in the position, that's why I think holding the position is better than going in and out of the position, because the brain doesn't really, it's like, oh, I'm in, I'm out, I'm in. It's like when I go there, it's like, oh, I don't like this. I'm getting a stretching effect, but now I start doing this activation or this isometric contraction, low level. You're not trying to kill it. You're just trying to engage the system. Like, so if I said push into the bench on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm talking about pushing a 2 to a 3, like a low level, just so the brain is like, oh, because you're doing two things anytime you get into these positions. One is you have the tissues that are restricting you from trying to get where you're going, the tight ones. And then you have the muscles that actually take you to where you're going, right? So in this analogy, I'm doing both. I'm going to the position where the tight ones are on stretch. But instead of just letting them be on stretch, what I'm trying to do is activate the ones that take me where I'm also trying to go. And this is where that brain piece kicks in, where the brain's like, oh, I'm getting stronger in this position. And if I'm strong, I'm safe. And then it will let those short ones go.
That was like when I read some of the work of Pavel Tsatsouline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the things that I read that he had was you if you're going to do, let's use the pigeon stretch or the 90-90 again. Especially if you're really tight, if you put that pressure of that shin and that knee into the ground and activate things at least for 5 to 10 seconds and then let it go, everything seems to relax and you can go deeper. So is that because it's being stabilized you're activating it, and then you
The brain is getting the muscle is getting neurologically stronger in that position because you're basically using isometrics, like I said, to attack the muscle spindle, which communicates with the brain. And so when the brain says, "Oh, I'm actually strong and I'm okay here," it lets the other ones go, right? So traditionally, like in that example, you might the old contract relax. You might have had a therapist put their hand on the inside of your knee and had you try to pull your knee off of the bench. Where I'm saying it's the opposite. I want to drive my knee down into the bench.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm using the muscles that take me further into external rotation in that example versus the muscles that contract relax the opposite direction. So one is a contract relax and one is an isometric. And I find the isometric works way, way better. Right? I even did, I think, the very second World Golf Fitness Summit. Before I had the Why Am I Tight talk, I did a talk called The Power of Isometrics. And I think isometrics still are the most underutilized rehabilitation and performance tool there is, both from a high intensity, fast twitch muscle fiber perspective, from a low level activation mobility perspective. I think we really don't use isometrics the way we should. I use them a ton, but I think as an industry, we're totally lost on isometrics. It's starting to get a little popularity now. It's starting to a little bit, but I still think we're way underutilizing it.
Yeah, you don't see hardly any isometrics across. You don't see anybody posting on it. It's not sexy to sit there and hold a position.
It doesn't look like you're moving. Well, you're not moving because the essence of isometric is there's no change in the length of the muscle. But I'm telling you, from a neural perspective, it is one of the most powerful things. And like in my example, trying to change range of motion, using it, you want a low level intensity. But there's also super high intensity isometric work. I mean, we know like from a power perspective, people use like thigh pulls, stuff like that, where you're pulling as hard as you can. We also know it's a great measure of force. It's a great way to recruit fast twitch muscle fibers if you've done at a super high intensity for short duration, right? So versus holding something for 5-10 seconds at a low intensity, really quick, explosive pops of isometrics can be great for other things as well. They're just really underutilized massively in my.
When you were on before, when we were talking about velocity, measuring velocity to determine if somebody should train for more strength and power or more for speed, and how to navigate through that and identify what's required for that particular golfer or person. How does somebody determine if they don't have the equipment you do? Because as somebody lifts weights, they're going to become less pliable. They're going to become more rigid. They're going to lose range of motion, whether it's in the articulation of the spine or the shoulder capsule, the hip joint. How do you balance keeping somebody flexible enough, whether they're a tour pro or they're an average Joe coming to see you, and maintaining strength?
Yeah. So
Because
look, one thing
if they
about
continue to work out, they're going to get less mobile and flexible. But if they stretch too much, then they
not
lose.
necessarily. Like I said, if you get strong in the right way and your body senses proper motor control and stability in those positions, you actually should get more flexible if you do your strength training properly. The problem is most people don't have good joint centration. They don't have a lot of things we just talked about. And then they go load up the dysfunction, right? So you have this dysfunction, you now go load it like crazy. And then, yes, you do get tighter. But if you can get strong in proper alignments with your joints in good positions and all that stuff, you should theoretically actually get more mobile. The thing about lifting super heavy when we get into like maximal loading, and, a lot of people love to promote that now in, sport performance, and especially in golf, you hear, oh, just lift heavy, increase your force. It's like, look, we weigh the golf club in grams. It's not that heavy. Let's be honest. And like when you're doing maximal loading, tension is your friend. Like you want lots of tension in what you're doing. And to lift something heavy and move it, you're going to end up moving it slow, right? Because you can't lift something super heavy, super fast. So you create this really slow, tension-driven system where speed is about like light switches that get flipped on and off. You want it on, off, on, off, on, off, where the muscle contracts and relax and contracts and relax and contracts and relax. It's a totally different motor system. So part of, I think, the problem is not just that the strength part is bad. It's that you're changing your motor programming, if that's the majority of your training, to be a tension-driven system. instead of being a light switch, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Right.
completely.
So we're trying to move a golf club. It's not that heavy. We want to be fast. Right. And I don't know if we talked about this last time. I know you and I have spoken about this in general. Right. Is that we see in Major League baseball pitchers, you can throw a ball well over 100 miles an hour. That you look at them, they're tall, skinny string beans, or just guys with little tiny arms and legs. Under any force measure of how much can you squat, bench press, whatever measure you want to use, they certainly would not be in any elite population, but yet they can throw a ball faster than almost anybody in the world. We see in basketball with guys with little tiny legs who can jump out of the building, right? We see golfers who are skinny who can hit it 300 plus, right? We don't have to be this muscular thing. And I think in our last talk, we talked about fascial players versus muscular players,
Yes.
and that kind of stuff, right? So maybe this is more of a fascial type of question. But I think if we took most great power lifters who would obviously score great on those tests we just talked about, and we said jump as high as you can, throw a ball as fast as you can, swing a golf club, they probably wouldn't swing it very fast because their motor system is driven around high tension work, right? It's not about light switches, where I think, we need to have a decent base of strength. But I think once we get that decent base of strength, we need to do way more ballistic high velocity work, eccentric high velocity work than we do need to be spending time on just, deadlifting more, bench pressing more pull-ups, more whatever. Like I just don't, there's a lot of people promoting that on the internet, and I think it's absolute nonsense.
I was watching the other day, I was scrolling through Instagram, I think it was, and I came across a page. It was the Korean powerlifting team or Olympic weightlifting team, I think. And it was, had to be guys that it didn't show their program, but it showed that they were goofing around. These 3 or 4 young guys, probably late teens, early 20s. And one of the guys, what they were doing was they were stacking plates, 45 and 90-pound plates on top of one another. And then they were from a standing static position, they'd squat down a little bit and they'd jump to see how high they could jump onto this platform. And the one guy, I'm going to just assume based off the height of all of them, that this guy was probably around 5'4". And he literally, and he wasn't muscle bound. He might have been a Olympic lifter of some sort. He had to be, but he wasn't like the strong man. Just eat as much. He's eating 10,000 calories a day, just on mass bulk. Very in great shape. But this kid was jumping almost his height, so he had
So let's
explosive
separate,
speed.
but let's separate powerlifting from Olympic lifting. And maybe a lot of people don't know the difference.
Yeah, because that's why I bring this up. Many people aren't
Power
going to understand
lifting is squat, deadlift, bench press, that stuff. Just how much weight can you lift? Those
West
are not
side
very
barbell type stuff.
correct, right? Powerlifting is a different thing. Olympic lifting, we're talking about cleans, snatches, push jerks, that kind of stuff. Those are ballistic, high velocity, explosive movements, right? Those people are super powerful and have speed because they are turning the light switch on and off really fast under real load, right? Pretty cool. Olympic lifters, you watch a guy who sets a world record in the deadlift. I mean, it takes him a long time to get that weight off the floor into full standing, right? Like that's a totally different thing. So, I think maybe the general public also sometimes confuses and doesn't really know the nuanced difference between what Olympic weightlifting is and powerlifting. And those are very, very different things.
Along those lines, if somebody's working out, let's say they go to the gym and maybe they have a local trainer who's beginner level. I'll just classify it as that to be respectful. Not to say they don't know what they're doing,
Yeah.
but they have
Young
some
training
knowledge.
age, whatever. Yeah.
But along those lines, as far as ballistic, if they're going to do their exercises, would it be better for them to train in more of a lift the weight relatively quickly or as fast as they can ballistic and then lower it at let's say a 4 to 6 second count so that they're getting the ballistic part and they're getting the eccentric?
Yeah, look, I think you can play around with all that stuff. I mean, I love with my guys in season, we'll do, let's just say I'll use like a split squat as an example. We might do a 5 down, 5 hold up as fast as you can. So I'm getting an eccentric, an isometric, and then a ballistic on top, right? So again, like I only have so much training time in season. We're trying to do stuff like that, but that's a really cool way to kind of tap into a little bit of everything if you don't have flywheels and other stuff with you, right? So I can get into kind of, hey, let's grab two dumbbells. Let's get in a split squat. Ready, down, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, hold, 2, 3, 4, 5, up as fast as you can, right? Like that's one rep. I mean, there's a lot going on there and you're stimulating a lot of different stuff. And that works really, really well, especially when you're in your maintenance phases to kind of hang on to the eccentric and ballistic work you've done when your volumes of that stuff is going to go down. I can kind of pair it into one thing.
Yeah, I
I think
saw.
we used to think that, oh, you can't train for power while you train for endurance, or you can't train for this while you we're learning that's all nonsense. You can get faster and more fit and all at once. Like that's silly. Right? We used to think if you're in power, you have to only do power. Or if you're in strength, you have to only do strength. And like the old periodization models, the Tudor Bompas of the world and all that stuff, it was like you did a max strength phase and you did a conversion to power phase and blah, blah, blah. You know what we're learning is you can have some heavy stuff and some fast stuff and we're all in the same workout. And you can improve all of those physiologic traits if you give them the right stimulus simultaneously.
I forget who it was. I'm not a big football guy. I mean, I'll watch, of course, national championships coming up, NFL playoffs, but I forget which running back it was. He's one of the best in the league. I know that. That's why he was on here. But he was doing a Bulgarian split squat, and he was doing, I think he was holding something around each hand. He had 80 to 100 pounds maybe. He's doing sets of 5. But then he drops them and he picks up, I think, 50s, and he starts doing it where he's getting as high as he can with his lead leg. So he goes from heavy to ballistic, like instantly. And I'm like,
Yeah,
oh my, that's
contrast
incredible.
training, that's called. And now there's the French contrast. We used to call them complexes. Donald Chu used to have, different names for it. It's all different. Supersetting, however you want to do it, right? Sometimes supersetting might be different body parts. Complexing tends to kind of be more like a strength followed by a ballistic movement of the same muscle groups. There's lots of ways you can start mixing and matching and pairing these things for different types of stimulus. And, what's good about some of that stuff is just efficiency of time.
Well, you had mentioned, and we talked about it quite a bit in the last time you were on. You had brought up the difference between fascia type golfer or athletes, golfers will focus on in this versus power. And Bryson,
Muscular versus fascial.
muscular versus fascia. Bryson Brooks would be examples for people if you didn't hear Ben's other episode, but I'd highly recommend you go listen to that. And then like a Justin Thomas, Joaquin Neiman, Akshay Bhatia would be the fascial type of
Yep,
golfers. It's
for
not
sure.
muscular. Outside of just looking at somebody and seeing that, okay, this guy's a beanpole, this guy's got some mass to him.
Oh, and look, there's hybrids too. There are people
Yeah.
who are kind of using some and some. I don't want to make it seem like you have to be in a bucket. Let's call it a continuum. And
Yes,
I'm
that was
giving
my
you
next
examples
question.
at the ends of the continuum. People slide along the way.
Is there, without giving up the sheer secret sauce, is there a way outside of just looking at somebody's body that you can, someone at home right now can get their golf buddy or their spouse or their brother or their sister and say, hey, let's do this test to see what I am? Is there something
Yeah,
like
look,
that?
obviously, I have force plates and all kinds of high tech technology and where I do different types of specific testing to measure this stuff. Obviously, if you're on the extremes, the eye test is pretty easy to do. Like you said, you look at Akshay, you're like, man, that guy's a pretty tall, skinny kid, but boy, he can move the ball. He's got a lot of speed. Like, okay, that's obvious. I look at Brooks, you go, man, that guy's pretty jacked. If you watch him ever work out in the gym, he can move real weight. He's a strong, powerful dude. It's like, okay, he's using that system, right? When you start getting in the middle of the continuum is where you have to have some pretty sophisticated testing equipment and know really what you're looking at. I think for the average person, you're probably not going to figure it out. I think most of us innately could say, I'm strong and slow, I'm fast and weak, I'm kind of in the middle. Right. So, I think most of, when you grew up as a kid and you're now a golfer, well, were you on the cross country team or were you a sprinter on the track team? Right? If you're on the cross country team, you're probably a little bit more of a slow twitch guy, blah blah blah, on one end of that continuum. And if you were a sprinter, you're probably a fast twitch guy. And then you can say, okay, well, I was fast, but I'm not really that jacked, right? You even look at sprinters. Obviously, a guy like Usain Bolt had like height and so lever advantage, mechanical advantage, but he wasn't jacked. Like some of these guys look like middle linebackers. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's this whole continuum of stuff that you got to figure out. But I think you could figure out where you fall. And I think generally, I don't know if we talked about this in the last time, but like if you're on that strength side, the muscle side of things, or traditional type of training, you want to have some ballistic stuff, but strength type of work, traditional uniplanar squats, deadlifts, that stuff is great. And I think that if you're kind of more the fascial guy, I think we find that for those people looking at things kind of more like the old, the term people used to use was functional training, multiplanar training, whatever you want to call it, right? It's like we go through these phases where we used to just do strength and then we had this functional and now there's kind of a pushback the other way. But there's a reason why people got benefits and certain people thrived in different ones. So my thing is I think they're all good. And I don't think that anyone needs to only do from one bucket or the other because we all have muscles and we all have fascia, right? So we probably should try to stimulate all of that system at some point, as long as it's at the right time and in the right place. But generally speaking, I find it's always easier to maximize something someone's already naturally good at versus changing them into trying to be something they're not naturally, right? It's going to be hard to take Akshay and turn him into Bryson. Right? I mean,
I don't care how many.
There's probably not going to ever be enough time in your life to make that happen, right? So it's like, hey, he's pretty successful. He's a super talented kid, obviously, right? I mean, so if he's going to be good at this, maybe I give him one or two like basic heavy things just to kind of keep his foundation up. But then I would be training him multiplanar type of stuff because I think that feeds his superpower, let's call it, right? So I think we all kind of know where we probably fall within reason based on our lifelong sports history, that I'm better at fast explosive stuff, I'm better at really heavy stuff, I'm better at long distance stuff, I'm better at whatever. And then you can kind of use those principles of, hey, I'm more on the fascial side, multiplanar, versus I'm more on the muscular side, more traditional strength work.
And you could, if somebody that was a hybrid, let's say on a leg day, they're doing a split squat, they're doing some sort of deadlift, and then they're doing leg extensions, leg curls. Would they benefit from, let's say, two of those? They're doing heavier, lower reps, and then the other two they're doing faster, more ballistic. Like let's say on the split squat, they're going to do 5.
If I got someone who's a hybrid, I would probably use some plyos and movement stuff to do their high ballistic stuff, and I would probably try to do some multiplanar type stuff. And even with my lunges, instead of just doing a split squat, I might do like a forward side crossover lunge combo move. Right? Where I'm kind of lunging forward, lunging back, lunging side, crossing over, whatever type of, doing a multiplanar lunge as opposed to just split squatting.
Very interesting. I got to whenever you're back, you got to let me know. I got to get down there and see you because I got a whole bunch of shit going on. I need someone at least at your level to figure this shit out. I want to move into Dr. Tyler Standifer was on. We reached out to about some things that he and I discussed that were very interesting, is what he's finding in his research. We kind of touched on one where it was when you get into eccentric loading, the old idea as far as coming from the weightlifting community was you do a minimum of 10-second eccentric work. So if for people out there who don't understand what the eccentric is, on a squat, you would load a bar up with, let's say, 20 to 30% more of the weight that you would do on a 1 rep max where you're pushing up.
Supra maximal.
Yes, you're going super max because supposedly the muscle in the lowering portion of the exercise can handle more, and it works more of the muscle fibers. Works 90%.
It's stronger. Yeah, you are stronger eccentrically than you are concentric.
And the old theory on that, or coming from the bodybuilding powerlifting community, was you do a minimum 10-second eccentric. So the lowering portion, you're going to do a squat. If you can do 100 pounds, just for easy math, you're going to put 130 on, and you're going to lower 10 seconds. You're going to stop, have somebody lift it back up for you, and then you're going to do that again. But what Dr. Standifer was finding was, as far as the ballistic portion that we've been talking about, that old model is not, it doesn't transfer into golf, and that golf, with a transition of a swing where it's going, the backswing's going, then you're quickly transitioning to the downswing. That more the ballistic, what we've been talking about, eccentric would be better. So how much load can you work eccentrically in a quarter of a second? So you're doing a heavy weight faster.
So there's a lot of ways to play around with this from an exercise perspective, right? So there is velocity component to all of this stuff, right? And even doing the super maximal stuff, we know that a lot of injuries happen in the eccentric phase, right? But they're usually a timing thing, right? You step off the curb, you roll your ankle. Well, it's because the muscle didn't fire on time, not because you didn't have the eccentric strength. If it's going to take me 10 seconds to get my eccentric working, it's already over. I had a quarter of a second to catch myself and be done, right? So that's partly why, even though people do Nordic hamstring curls and all this stuff, and people still love to measure and test all that stuff, the reality is we know it has very little correlation to hamstring pulls and injuries because it's a slow thing, right? So, you could do simple things like box drops. Like you could go onto a plyo box, you can step off and catch yourself and brace you. So the force is pretty high, but it's happening at high velocity. I can go into a split squat, I can just drop down and catch myself under load. I can do that type of stuff, which basically you don't need any special equipment really. You can stand a bench, jump off, do whatever, assuming that you have some base of training experience, stuff like that. I'm not telling somebody if you've never exercised, go start standing on benches and jumping off and trying to slam on the brakes as fast as you can.
Go to the landing of your steps and jump 10 steps down and try to catch
Yeah,
yourself.
I'm not advocating for that unless it's under proper guidance. But my point is you don't need any fancy type of equipment and you can create that type of eccentric loading at high velocity, right? I think and I've said this before, probably not on here, but if I could have one piece of exercise equipment nowadays with all the stuff that's out there, is I would have a flywheel. I think you can throw the rest of your gym away basically at this point. I have a lot of other stuff besides flywheels, but I have a lot of flywheels. And I've been using flywheels for about 15 years now. And the magic in flywheels is that you have this high velocity eccentric component, right? Because it's using inertia. For people who don't know what a flywheel is, it's a plate looking thing, or some of them are conical shaped, right? And it's responding to the force you give it. So you can put different weight plates on, so different size wheels, let's say. So obviously you can spin a smaller one faster than you can spin a big one. And the weight starts spinning, the plate starts spinning as you move it. And for as much as you give it on the concentric on the way out, it's going to yank you back with that much on the way back in, right? So that's a pretty cool thing because that's what happens in the real world. It's basically, you're basically called flywheel training. It's inertia training. You're training inertia. The real world is inertia, right? So you have to overcome inertia, which is what we do in everyday life. That's what our world is, overcoming inertia, right? So if I have a flywheel and I'm doing a rotary motion and I get to the top of, let's call it my backswing or the back of the rotational component, and now it's yanking me back hard, and I got to actually stop this thing. So now I'm under high velocity, eccentrically braking it. Then earlier we talked about the undervalue of isometrics. I have to dead stop it so I can then actually go into re-accelerating it in the concentric phase on the way down. No other type of training equipment lets you get all of that with velocity at the same time in a safe, effective way. It is, if you want to get better, and there's still so many gyms who don't have it. Yes, you need to coach people. If I owned a general public gym, I wouldn't put it in there because people will kill themselves. But if I'm in a facility where I have people working with coaches, if you don't have one, the price point is not that high for most of it. You're making a massive mistake. You're making a massive mistake. This is one of the greatest stimuluses you can create. I've gotten a lot of buddies of mine who are famous strength coaches in all different sports on flywheels over the last 10 years. And it's pretty universal. The people who are committed to doing it on a regular basis all would say the same thing. There are some who are like, I'm not really sure. But when you ask them how much they really use it and how much they've done and talk about their programming with it, it's like, well, you just haven't used it right. Right? That's like, you could say kettlebells are good or bad. Anything is good or bad. It's like, how do you use it? How often do you use it? What's the prescription of it? All of those things, right? So, and again, and within what we just talked about, we talked about that fascia versus muscular. I could have a big giant wheel that's moving really slow. The eccentric load is way higher, but it's moving way slower. Or I can have a little tiny wheel that I can get that thing absolutely flying. So the load is lower, but the velocity is higher. So I can even play in the flywheels along that kind of force velocity continuum as well.
I've had friends that had them, and the only I've seen where, it's like a stand, and then the wheels are under there, and it's like it's trying to describe this, it's like a pulley, you're pulling up on something.
Well,
How would
there's
you?
boxes that you stand on that have a vertical pull.
Yeah.
And then there's actually cables that are like cable columns that you can move on a horizontal, on a diagonal, high to low to high,
That's what I was
horizontal.
getting at. How would you use something like a wood chop to imitate a golf swing? And you just answered the question.
Correct. And nowadays, it used to be standalone things. Nowadays, almost all the companies that make them actually have like rack mount ones that you literally can go to any squat rack and you just pop them right into the holes of the squat rack. And that's where you mount it and you just use it off of there. It's awesome.
Very cool. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about was that with the smart to move, that the data that they're coming out with is the impulse. So they're finding out impulses, and talking to Doc, he does some work with speed sticks, and Patrick Harrington is their ambassador, and he was mentioning how Patrick has a very long impulse, as far as in his swing. Is there a way that someone that's listening, well, first, can you describe what the impulse is so they understand it? And second, is there a way to develop that for a golfer that's out there that wants to improve that?
So a couple things to unpack here, because A, is it good for everyone also is a bigger question.
Yes, that would be
So
always.
impulses, imagine I have a force plate. We'll use a jump as an example because I think it's an easier way to understand it, right? And so if I'm starting at 0%, I'm use body weight as the example so people can follow along. I'm not going to talk in newtons here because that might get a little whatever. So let's just say I'm standing on the force plate. I'm at my body weight, so we'll call that 0. Then when I'm about to do my jump and I start bending my legs and squatting, I get lighter because I'm distributing the weight out front to back. So the direct force straight down is less, right? If I'm standing up like a pencil, the force is going straight through the ground, right through my body. As soon as I bend my knees, my hip goes back, my knees go forward, my chest comes forward, whatever. That now it's covering over it. So the actual force straight down is less. So as I squat down, now my body weight went below the 0 line. And then I'm like, okay, now I'm going to jump. So I start pushing down into the platform and then it spikes up. And then it comes back down, obviously, as I land and hit the ground. So if we look under that curve, the area under the curve, that is the impulse. So it's the amount of force and the time together, right? I created this much, but I actually was pushing for this long. It's not like a up and down, it's up and down, right? Like, is it a mountain or is it a spike, for lack of a better way of saying, right? So we know that. The guys on the European Tour have been doing for the last 2 years, Simon Brearley and a bunch of guys at the Tour fitness trailers there, they've been using vault forward places. And same to what they're saying is they basically showed that the guys with the fastest club head speeds, just using vertical jump, had the highest impulse in their jumps, right? Because we know that vertical force in a golf swing, if you look at force plate data, vertical force is pretty well correlated to club head speed, right? So if you look at someone like Podrick, when he wants to absolutely smash it, he kind of really whines forever and turns and lets that left knee kick in, the heel come up, and he literally, so let's call it, he increases his hand path. So that's giving him more time under the curve. Well, because his force might still be the same. I haven't looked at his data. I can't answer that. But certainly his time got greater. So speed should go up, right? That being said, and I don't want to get into name dropping or calling out people or whatever, if you follow along on the internet with Podrick, who puts a lot of stuff obviously out on the internet, right? He can crush it. He literally can crush it. And some of the biomechanics guys he works with talk about how great he's playing, and these guys we're doing research with, blah, blah, blah. But if you actually watch him play, he very rarely ever hits that shot, right? That's not how he plays golf. And the guys with the biomechanics and swing coaches who say they're his coaches, who are promoting themselves on the internet, are actually not the guy. If you go to a tour event and Podrick's there, Pete Cowan's his coach standing next to him on the range. And I can promise you that's not what he's doing. I'm not saying he never goes, oh, I got to let one go here and carry this long bunker or whatever, where he might step into those things he's learned from those guys. So I'm not saying it's not valuable and what they've provided isn't good. It is, but that's not fundamentally how he plays golf, right? And I think we always have to be careful at chasing speed and how that relates to golf. And obviously for the amateurs, distance is a problem, right? Most amateurs should be releasing everything anyway because they're not flexible enough to actually turn their shoulders far enough back without letting their hips release to the backside anyway, right? I do a presentation called Resistors and Releasers, and I look at a lot of force plate data while you're swinging and talk about who should be resisting their hips on the way back and actually trying to use elasticity to create speed, and who should be kind of releasing and let everything turn like Podrick's doing, create a longer hand path and create a longer impulse as a way to create speed. The average golfer who sits behind a desk all the time probably has some value in doing that, right? If I took Tony Finau and did that, I don't think he would be a better golfer. He might hit it farther, but I don't think he would be a better golfer.
Yeah,
or
in
Gary
fact, he's
Woodland,
gone the other way.
Gary Woodland, or any of those type of guys.
Yeah, Tony used to have a long swing that he hit it. I mean, I think what did he hit? 200 and some miles an hour ball speed when they were playing around, where he really stretches.
When he decided he wanted to get better to golf, he's still elastic enough that he could still move it out there in the elite group, even on tour, with a much shorter swing. Right? Gary Woodland's got short elastic swing. There's plenty of guys who have short elastic swings.
So Tony's actually gone shorter on his impulse, or in what I've
Correct.
seen,
And he plays better golf.
to play better golf. Yes.
Correct. So I think we got to be careful in who we prescribe these things to. Right. And then there's other relationships to this as well. Like if we looked at those jumps again, and we were just before, we were talking about eccentric velocities and all that stuff. We also would say the people who have the highest force outputs that are obviously part of that impulse calculation are the people who do that de-weighting phase of the jump the fastest and who can actually create muscle stiffness at the bottom the best. Right. The guy who goes down slow doesn't go up very fast. Mm-hmm. The guy who drops down quick and actually can brace up and store that energy in the system, those guys launch themselves. The person who goes down slow for the jump doesn't store anything and gets nothing, right? So you also have to decide, is the person effectively, in the old days in golf, it was like, the sit move, right? In transition, that was loading the springs.
The Sam Snead squat. Yeah.
I mean, guys taught it forever. Shift, drop, drop, shift, turn, and go, right? I mean, so there's value, those are all just pieces. And the danger in research is we make blanket statements that may or may not be true, or even if they are true, may or may not be relevant to most people. And even within this impulse, I would still start with, okay, can they actually create eccentric braking effectively? Should they be turning because they're not flexible enough? Are they elastic or are they not elastic athletes? Why are we picking the strategy that we're picking as opposed to hit far? Because I think you and I talked before we started filming, is like on the PGA Tour, the chase for distance is kind of over, right? In the 10 years ago, when a lot of guys were hitting the ball with let's call it ball speeds in the 160s, fairway bunkers were in play. And so your choice was lay up behind it, thread the needle to the thin part of the fairway next to the bunker. And then a certain amount of guys were able to start flying the bunkers. And all of a sudden, that's usually where the fairway gets really wide. So it was a massive advantage. If you could fly the bunkers versus being a guy who has to either be perfect and thread the needle, or you're like, hey, I don't know if I can thread that needle. I'm going to have to lay it back. Now I'm 40 yards behind you because I laid shorter than I normally swing and you piped it over. We saw all this studies and data coming out about how distance was correlated so much with, winning and driving statistics and all this stuff, right? But now everybody's kind of done their work, and most guys on the PGA Tour are swinging in, their ball speeds are in the 170s, mid 170s. So almost everybody can fly those bunkers. I mean, is there occasionally a hold here or there where, being in the 180s probably helps? Sure. But over the course of the season, that is not the priority anymore. And so even just working with players, I have a lot less guys talking about speed now than we ever have. It's like, okay, we just knew we had to get into that mid 170 to 180. We got everybody there. And now it's like, okay, I'm good. That's not going to win. So Daniel Berger's a client of mine. He was 4th in total driving on the PGA Tour last year. And he hits a 298, which is plenty far. But that's 100th in driving distance. But he was still 4th in total driving and on the whole tour. And what you also realize is being 100th, the guy who might be 50th hits it 2 yards farther than you. Everybody is within such a tiny little bucket. We make it seem like one guy's hitting it 40 yards by another guy. If you go to a PGA Tour event, everyone's around the same spot. There's occasionally a guy who can bomb and you get a Bryson, obviously, or certain guys here or there. But outside of those handful of guys, everyone lands the ball within a couple yards of each other. And most times if you go to a tournament, if you walk with players like I do with my guy will hit it past their guy, the guys in his group 2 or 3 times. Then maybe 1 or 2, he hits it, but it's within a couple yards. It's not there. This massive difference, it just doesn't exist anymore. It's just not there, other than maybe a Bryson.
And I think the statistics guys that say, hey, if you hit it X amount further, you're going to hit your lower clubs closer. So on average, you're going to score lower. I'm like, yeah, there is that portion. But as we talked earlier, when you do studies, they always cut off, let's say 10, 20% of the polls. And then they take the average of the aggregate that's left. And it's like, okay, you don't do life by aggregates. If you ran a corporation or you ran your business only off numbers and you completely made decisions based off just numbers, there would never be a development of a culture within a company or a corporation or a golf facility or a team. I'm sure with your players, you're part of a team with their swing coach and their nutritionist and whoever else they have on their team, the psychologist. Um, and my area, Hilton Head, is a perfect example. It's a small area, but if you look at the numbers of the demographics, they're very high. So for decades, and I've lived here over 30 years, I see these big corporations come in. They think they're going to kill it. Okay, this is the median income, this is the median house price, this is this, that's, and the other thing, to where in average everyday big city America, that would make total sense for them to have a extremely successful business. But when they come here, it's so localized. People don't come on vacation to go to the same places they eat when they're at home. They want to go to the local shop. They want to go to the local coffee shop or the local golf shop or whatever local restaurants they have.
Best taco place in the country there.
Yes. And so I've watched for decades these corporations come in, but they're doing it only off numbers. And I know that's a big stretch of an analogy, but you can't just do everything off sheer numbers, not when there's so many intricate parts to not just being a world-class golfer, but just being a golfer that looks to improve. You can't just take one thing and improve on it, or number-wise, look at my numbers and say, I'm going to do this and get better. There's, as we've discussed, there's many, many parts, moving parts of this thing.
Averages are very dangerous. I mean, it's a great way to do research. And look, if you have 1 million people in your study and the average is like 800,000 of them, then maybe there's some real value in that. But most studies are 10 people, right? And there's so many elements, especially in golf. Like if you actually publish those in like a real like medical journal, very few of them would even they wouldn't even accept your study basis and your study, structure and all that stuff, right? You don't have any controls, you don't have double blinds, you have no idea what the person does outside of that test, with their training, with their practice. You have no idea about anything about these people, right? There's so many other elements that go into performance and why someone does what they do, physical evaluations, you name it, right? Training history, coaching history, whatever the case may be. So most of these golf studies are just looking at very small sample sizes with very little constraints on kind of understanding all the people within them and all the elements that make them do what they do. So I think as a science, it's just bad science, right? Like I think I gave you an example. There was a biomechanist doing a short game study who, when I was working with Luke Donald, I still work with Luke now, but it was one of the greatest chippers probably of all time, wanted to do a biomechanics study of chipping and had Luke, they collected Luke's data and they sent us this giant report on what Luke should be doing better so he could be like their average data set. And it was like, huh? I go, how about no one in your data set is better than Luke at chipping? Not one person. He's better than every single person. So you're telling me the way to help him is to make him closer to your PGA Tour data set? No, you're going to make him worse. They should all be more like him, right? I remember when TrackMan first came out, being with Luke, the original belief was, and the guys from TrackMan came to spend some time with us doing some short game stuff also. The guys from TrackMan came to see us and they were telling us, oh, on a 30-yard shot, you should get 3,000 spin. And on a 40-yard shot, you should get 4,000 spin. And they put that Luke up for a 40-yard shot and he had 11 or 12,000. And they were like, ooh, maybe, at least to their credit, even maybe they were like, well, maybe we don't yet understand this. Because if this guy is hitting 3 times the number we think is ideal, that's probably not ideal, right? Like, at least to their credit, they did it. Where the other guy is sending us reports telling us what he should do different, as opposed to, I just go, maybe you should tell them what they should do different, right? And you can't put Hunter Mahan in the same group with Luke Donald on chipping and tell Luke he should be more like, what Hunter Mahan's doing. Mm-hmm. Nothing against Hunter, but he was a bad chipper. Great player, but bad chipper.
That's where I think the industry is going as a whole. There's people like you out there in your side of the industry who already understand the nuances of all the different sciences and what science or what portion of the data to utilize for that golfer for what they need at that time. I think the masses, or it's starting to get to the masses with all the data collection that we have due to technology over the last 10 years or even 15 years, that people are starting to understand, well, wait a minute. What we thought was science 10, 15 years ago, it is a science, but it's not a full spectrum. It doesn't apply to everybody. There's nuances. And why are these nuances there? Why can somebody like Luke Donald have 11,000 RPM when our physics say it should be 3,000 to 4,000? What are we missing here? So science is always going to go back because it's only based off what can be measured. It doesn't take into account the things. And like, obviously, and I don't beat up, I'm a big fan of his. I don't beat up on Scott Fawcett at all. but he's obviously a big numbers guy, and he's a science guy. And I have a friend who's a mathematician. I think he has 2 master's degrees. He's a math teacher, and he's a big science guy. And I say, and I know the answer to this. I always tell him, "Do you love your wife and your kids?" And he says, "Of course I do. What kind of stupid question is that?" I said, "Okay, how do you know? How do you quantify it? If you think everything is based off numbers and science, how do you quantify how much you love your wife and kids?" And the point I was trying to make to him is there's certain things that we can't measure yet, or that the measurements don't understand the people who are doing the research. So just because it doesn't fit into that silo does not mean that what somebody's doing should not be looked at deeper, and maybe they're doing it a way that your science
Look,
hasn't
I mean,
figured out to do.
most of the time, studies are a lagging indicator of everything, right? People do stuff and they're like, oh, I've been doing this and it's worked over and over and over again. And when enough people say that, someone goes, oh, maybe we should study and see why that's happening, right? It's like, right? It's very rarely this the researchers come up with the new solution and say, oh, this is what we figured out. No, a practical guy like me figured something out, and enough other practical people say, oh, you know what, I trust Ben, so I'm going to try what he's saying. And then enough people do it, and then everybody's getting the same result. And someone says, hey, let's do a study, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's a lagging indicator. So I always tell people, like, you want to be evidence-based if it can disprove something that you're doing. But you don't have to only do evidence-based, because show me the evidence based on acupuncture. Been around forever. Yeah. You can't measure it. You can't tell me what it's doing. Oh, it's some magical meridian line someone drew on a graph that you can't see on an MRI or an X-ray or a blood test, or there's no way to see. But guess what? Millions of people do it and feel way better. You can't, like foam rolling for years, everyone said there's no science for that. It does anything. But yet millions of people were doing it every day and going, you know what? I feel a lot better. I'm okay when millions of people tell me I feel better. I'm going to go with there's something there, and we just haven't yet figured out what it is, right? It's the debate with sauna and cold plunge now, all of this stuff, right? Cold plunge, blah, blah, blah. Oh, there's no research. You know what? This is better than that one. This is it's like, we have bits and pieces of information, but we don't understand until look, you talk to I've never talked to anybody who gets serious about cold plunging who says, wow, I don't feel way better. So the people who tell me cold doesn't help inflammation, I don't know. You better show me what's happening to these millions of people that they go, I love it, I crave it, I feel way better, my body feels better, my joints hurt less. Something's happening. And it's not 10 people saying it, it's millions, right? So we just haven't answered the question yet. We have to always say, have we asked all the right questions? Have we done the right studies? Have they been big enough? Have the right people done them? But when masses feel it, see it, and do it, you can't just throw that out as I don't have research to support.
No, and it's not only that millions of people are doing it. It's like you said, acupuncture is thousands of years old. Chinese medicine is 6,000 plus years old. Cold plunge or getting into cold water, if you go to the Scandinavian area, Europe, and that's been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, as has saunas. It's like it does something good.
Yeah, but now people are saying, oh, there's no research to support that cold helps with inflammation. It's actually stopping it, and you want the inflammation. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'll say. I'm not going to sit here and say no, but and I do understand the argument that inflammation is the body's natural response to a stress, and it's a way that it kind of heals itself. But does that mean that you can't speed that process up by using cold? So is it definitively stopping me from healing, or is it speeding up the healing? I don't know. How do you answer that question?
Well, I think it to put it in context, because I've been doing cold plunges for 7, 8, 9 years, and Doc Seeger's a friend of ours, both of ours, and he's obviously doing a ton of research with Morozco Forge. But the as far as the weightlifting and recovery, I think what has come out and is somewhat accepted is you don't want to do your cold plunge if you're doing a training session. As far as weightlifting, you don't want to do a cold plunge within 6 hours of that training session.
Yeah, I still think that's nonsense also. It probably down-regulates your protein synthesis a little bit, but I don't think it stops you from getting gains. And I think the only thing that it really stops you from getting is hypertrophy. I don't think it stops you from getting strong. I think from a muscle growth perspective, it probably down-regulates protein synthesis a bit. But for my golfers, we just want to feel good and go play golf tomorrow. I don't care how jacked I am. I want to be strong and I want to be able to perform. I'm not looking for hypertrophy, right? So
that was what I was going to get to.
If you go on the tour
golfers.
trailer, we have cold plunges out there. It's 95 degrees, man. I just finished at 7:30 at night. I got to get up at 4:30 in the morning to go tee it up in the morning. I jump in that cold plunge. I feel way better from being drained out of being in the sun and the heat and walking all day. I go in there for 6 minutes. I get out. I'm like, I feel like a new person. I'm
Mm-hmm.
ready to go back, have something to eat, go to bed, and do it again. I don't. It takes me the entire night to recover from being out in the heat for 6 hours in my pants, walking around in 90-degree weather in Memphis. I mean,
Yep.
like, what's your purpose? What are you doing? Like, if anybody wants to tell me that that's not true, then you're clueless.
Yeah, that was the other thing is for like endurance thing, like golf or tennis or cycling or something like that, or any other sport that you need to recover and get back out and do it the next day or a day or two.
Correct.
Getting
Yeah.
in the
Not
ice
everybody can
after
say,
that
"Oh,
activity
I
is
got
great.
inflammation. Let me wait 9 days to get better." Like, that's not a practical. I made a post yesterday on Facebook about saying that the top coaches have a combination of great exercise prescription, motivation, discipline, and pragmatism. Right? The science people are so lost in the pragmatism piece.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is the real world. If I'm a guy who works at a executive at a company and I'm working Monday through Friday all day, I want to play golf Saturday and Sunday. I'm going 2 days in a row. I don't have 5 days to sit around. If I'm a tour player, I got Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I got to get on a plane and fly, which causes inflammation and all this stuff. And I got to go perform. Like, it's great. We could talk about something. It's great if you have nothing to do and you're willing to not train for 5 days in between. Like, what's the negative of not training for the 5 days? Right? Like, we got to have a pragmatic approach to how we approach performance and fitness and all of this stuff. And I think that's really where science gets lost. They don't understand the human. It's not pragmatic. It's just, I don't know. We could debate all that stuff all we want. And every time I bring in kind of my buddies who are PhDs and doctors and biomechanics and stuff to work with my players, that's always the biggest and hardest conversation for them to understand. It's like, no, you got to learn to deal with the human. The human element is the most important part of what you do, right? Like, I know you had Will Wu on recently, and Will's a good friend of mine, and we worked with Victor Perez together for a long time. And, he thinks when he started with him, he thought he was in a lab. And, oh, this research says this. I said, dude, that's not going to work. Like, he just shot 3 over, or he's got to get on a plane, or he's got to we need to do this in a real way that's going to help them. And you use as much of your hard science as you can, but you apply it in a pragmatic way. This is not a lab where you get to control everything at a university. This is the real world where millions of dollars are on the line every single week. We got to go play golf and we got to do it now. Don't tell me about all that other nonsense. I mean, that's all great. And I'm not saying don't do it, but how do you do it in a real way? And I think that's where guys who are researchers and scientists and working universities get lost.
In working with the ice that I have for so long, and mine, of course, is an N=1. But as you said, there's millions of people around the world. As you get on social media and chat rooms and talk to other people, the post when I started playing golf again a few years ago after being sick, I went and I walked one round, carried my bag, and played 18 holes. And my God, I got home, I was so sore and worn down, and I had to actually play a 1 day local pro-am the next day. And my girlfriend says, "You need to get an ice bath." And I said, "I'll try." I mean, what do I have to lose? I got in for 5 or 10 minutes and got out. I'm like, I feel pretty good. And the next morning I was like, it's like I never played yesterday. So there is something in there.
Of course. And every guy to a man says the same thing. So, you can tell me about all your research all you want, but at the end of the day, if that's how they feel, that was a win. Right.
Yes,
And it's like, science or no science.
and the other thing I learned was when like 4 years ago, excuse me, I had cancer and my testosterone had plummeted. I was down in low 200s, and I going through the cancer. You can't take testosterone because it's going to make everything grow. Doctor's like, you can't take that. And for a year after my surgery, I didn't take it until I got to a point where I eventually got back on because I needed to. But it was like, how am I going to get some energy and some motivation? It's like, okay, that supposedly the ice is going to do this, so that epinephrine, dopamine kick 15 minutes out for the next 4 to 6 hours was able to give me that energy, that the low testosterone that I didn't have anymore. So for me, it was a no brainer. It's like, okay, suffer, crank it down from 50 to 45, 45 to 40, go sub 40. It's like, okay, this is absolutely the most miserable 3 minutes of my
Oh, and
life.
people don't appreciate the difference between even 50 and 45 is massive.
It's massive. And, but
45 is way colder than 50.
yes, and then you do get addicted to it. And
48
you
is
start,
way colder than 50.
yes, it's incremental. And I tell you to do it incrementally. Like I tell you real quick, I don't want to burn too much time, but my brother got into it as well. And he said, well, where are you at? And I said, at the time, I think I was low 40s. I said, start at 50. So he got in at 50 a couple of times. Like, man, I really feel good. He dropped it down to, because back then I had the tank and we were dumping the ice in it. Now I've got a self-sustaining chiller and everything. But he goes, I'm going down to 42. And I go, don't, you're doing it too much. And he goes, well, I'm going to stay in it for 10 minutes too. And he's in there miserable and he gets out. Well, 3 days later, I told him, this is cellular level changes. You're going to screw yourself up. 3 days later, he calls me and says, I can't get off the sofa. I've been sleeping all day. I'm so tired. I said, yes, because your body's changing the cellular level and you ramped it up to DEFCON 5 and it can't adapt fast enough.
No, you don't go from 50 to 42 that quick. That's a process. So, and let me just go back 1 second about the Will conversation with Victor, right? The smart scientist, like a guy like Will, they don't even think about the human element because they're so trained this way, right? This kind of tunnel vision of how research works. Because part of their job to be a professor is they have to publish stuff, and that's how you get tenure at a university, and that's their business, right? But the smart ones realize, okay, eventually realize, oh, that's research, and this is the real world. And Will actually does an incredible job. And with Victor, I mean, I've told Will this. I mean, we were actually talking yesterday, and I said, look, you should be doing presentations on what you did with Victor because Victor went from the most lateral golfer you've ever seen to one of the most rotary, working with Pete Cowan now, kind of spiral staircase, and never lost his swing and actually got better at golf. And
Yeah,
that's a
that's a
big part
special
due to,
ability
we
to
did
be
some
able to do
stuff in
that.
the gym, but Will did an incredible job doing it with him. So that, there are guys like Will who you can kind of just say, hey, look, whoa, time out. Like, hey, these are the things, being out in the performance world and being with these guys for a long time, these are things you need to think about. And you use your science, but you got to blend it with the human. And this is how you kind of start doing it. And the guys who are smart, like a Will, figure it out. And I said to him, I go, look, you can't find a lot of people in history who have made as big of a swing change that Victor made and are still successful and have gotten better. Most people get way worse. I go, you're not giving yourself the credit that you deserve for what you did and how this practice stuff and all the stuff you're doing is. And, everyone, there are science guys who kind of get it. And then there's science guys who don't get it. And, a guy like Will actually gets it and has done an incredible job with the people he works with. And, again, I'm not here to promote his app or whatever, but if you're trying to get better at golf, I'm a huge fan of Will's work and would strongly recommend anybody get that practice coach
Yeah,
app.
the practice coach app is
Yeah, awesome. He's super smart and his stuff is really, really.
Not to switch gears too much, is I read up on what you've done and have talked to you enough, and you've helped me with some shoulder issue, and obviously are very good, and everybody speaks very highly of you. But as I went back and I was listening to our prior episode, one thing that is clearly evident is over the course of your career, you are exceptionally educated, not only in your specific discipline, but you've gone out and even taken coaching seminars and like the Mike Adams and the Terry Rolls things, and I'm sure you've done a lot more. That takes a certain type of mentality or discipline or a commitment to continue to learn. And where I'm going with this is there's some people out there, let's say they're a young assistant pro or they're just coming out of school with their strength and conditioning coach degree, and they might not have enough money, and they're not sure what to do, where to go. They're like, well, I got to work and I got to save money because I got to do this and I want to do that. But you over the course of your career, the best I can tell, have had a 100% commitment to improving yourself, not just for a certain period of time, but over the course of your entire career. So if there's that kid out there that is sitting there that is a Ben Shear at 22 years old, what do you tell them to make a commitment to? Okay, maybe I don't go on a weekend trip with my buddies or with my girlfriend or with my boyfriend, and I take that money and I go take a Ben Shear course, or I go take a Peter Gosky course, or I go to this. Is it sacrifice? Is it getting them to make that sacrifice mentally earlier in their career and then over the course of time? Because the money will come later on. That money is not the motivation.
Yeah.
How do they do that in your
Yeah. So
opinion?
you got to be willing to invest in yourself, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's your journey. We all have our own journey. And if we're not willing to invest in ourselves, then you're not going to, again, we were talking earlier about, the workouts, and I was talking about investments that give you an ROI later versus deposits and all of that kind of stuff, right? I think that's the same for personal development. Like when I was a young guy starting out, obviously we didn't have cool podcasts like this. There was no there was no internet to go learn anything. There were basically some books, but even in true training, there were, you had super training and, you know, some technical books that were out there, but there wasn't nearly the access to information that there is today. There was no TPI summits, there were no, right, whatever, MAT classes, there were no anything, right? So you had to kind of like go start figuring out your own. So like as a young guy myself, I mean, I remember I had no money. I mean, I was working in a gym. I was literally making $7 an hour. I would go to I had a car that needed a new muffler for about 3 years. I would go to a check cashing place, like where they were behind bulletproof glass, right? They would take 10% of your check. I was making like $300 a week. I was still like living at home in my mother's house. I would make a bowl of, I know you're not supposed to eat carbs, but I would make a big thing of like homemade sauce that had like meat in it and stuff like that, and pasta. And that would be the only food I would eat for the week, and frosted mini wheats or something. I mean, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And like, I saved my money, and I would literally take, of the $300 I made every week, I would take $100. And I had a guy who I thought was a really great trainer who was into plyometrics and Russian stuff. His name was Jeff Bell at the time. I have no idea what happened to the guy, but I would pay him $100 because that's how expensive this is. 88 or 89, or I mean, no, sorry, 1991, 92. I would pay him 100 of my $300 and go do a private session with him. And I would say, hey, today can we pretend like this guy? And I would just kind of create case studies. What would you do with this guy? Actually run me through it. Coach me through the exercise. How do you coach it? How do you talk about it? And I literally lived at home for years and ate nothing, drove an old broke down car, and all that stuff. And look, my goal was never at the time, I want to train professional athletes. I just wanted to be the best I could at what I did. I mean, I get calls from young trainers all the time. Oh, I want to be like you. I'm like, well, I didn't even want to be like me. I mean, that's just kind of the way it naturally evolved, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm very fortunate and things are great and all that stuff. I said, but I didn't go into this saying, I want to train professional athletes. I want to make X amount of dollars. I want to do any of these things. I went in just saying, hey, look, maybe it's because I'm a competitive person, is I want to be the best at what I do. That's the only thing that drove me. And I believe that if I could be really good at what I did, I would have success in some way. How that looked, felt, shaped, I didn't know. But I thought I would be successful. It's like, if this is the path I'm going to choose, well, I better get really good at it. Right? Where most people think, oh, I went to school, I have a degree in exercise physiology or kinesiology or whatever. That means nothing. I mean, I'm not saying it's not important to understand the body part, but that's not coaching. That's not training. That's not performance, right? That's the foundationary stuff that you build those things off of. So they are important to understand, but real coaching, training. I mean, I have a guy, I run a mentorship. I did run one, but I have a guy who was in my mentorship that literally called me this week. I mean, this guy's a really good trainer. He's a top 50 Golf Digest trainer. He's got some pro players, a good business. And he said to me, he's like, hey, can I pay you to just create scenarios and I write workout programs and you critique them and you tell me what I did wrong? Let's talk through why I picked what I picked. What would you have done different? And this is a super successful guy who's paying me now to basically go through his stuff he's doing. And this guy's at a level that most people would be excited to get to. Those of us who really do it, we never stop, whether it's a Mike Boyle. You could go down the list of the famous people. We don't stop learning. We're life learners. We're hungry for information. We have a passion for what we do. We always want to be better. We hate not being the best at what we do. And we're willing to do anything and everything that we can to get better. I mean, I just spent the last week, a week ago, I was in Hawaii at this thing with, it was me, Will, Sasha McKenzie, Mike Duffy, Terry Rolls. I spent a week with those guys just in Hawaii, just talking fitness, training, golf science, just all day, every day. I put myself in environments where I'm around other people who are smarter than me, A, and B, have different expertise, right? Terry obviously as a golf teacher, Mike and Sasho as biomechanists. We have a guy who's a incredible exercise PhD in physiology, who's probably the smartest guy of the whole group, who's part of this group. Will is in there with the motor learning side, right? So we're all sharing in how we put our formulas together, right? It is the recipes. It is all that stuff. And I think if you're young, using money as an excuse, I'm sure if I said to you, hey, let me see your budget and where you're spending all your money, I can find ways for you to spend some money on some things that are going to make you better. If you're willing to give up some of the beers and the date nights and other things, like how bad do you want it, right? Like how bad do you want to be successful? And I think, unfortunately, everyone wants to be successful, but very few people are willing to truly sacrifice to be successful. And you know what? In some way, it's good for me. It allows me to be where I am because most people aren't willing to do what it takes to be great.
One part of my curiosity on that is in my own head, I bounce around. Is that an innate thing that you're born genetically with, or is there something
That's
in
a good
your
question.
life that happened that drives someone like yourself to become like a Michael Jordan? He played his brother, and his brother was his biggest competition, and he sought his dad's approval so much that he wanted to beat his brother on a daily basis so bad to get that approval. And I'm always curious to find out what drives people who are the best, you being one of them, to in
Yeah,
an
I think
early
that's true.
age.
So, I think that's true. I originally was going to school for economics and finance. My dad's a big Wall Street guy. I told him I wanted to be a trainer. This is 1990. People didn't have trainers in 1990. That wasn't a thing. Like, what do you mean? I mean, maybe a couple movie stars to get ready for a movie had some whatever. And we went through some hard times. And I'm sure that part of my success was to show him that I wasn't an idiot and not following in his footsteps and finding my own path. And that, hey, maybe I might not financially be as successful and make Wall Street type money, but I could be pretty damn successful in the path that I've chosen. And look, if your path of choice was I want to be a trainer and I want to work with golfers, I would argue I'm more successful, right? I'm in a very small group of people who have been able to and fortunate enough to get to do the things I've been able to do and the successes I've been able to have. I'm very lucky and fortunate, and part of that comes with the hard work. But yeah, do I think that there's probably part of that where he was disapproving-ish, right? And look, looking back now as a father, I probably would have done the same. What do you mean? Are you crazy? That's not a job. Yeah, I could be able to support a family and have a life doing that, right? Like, it's like even like being a golf teacher. I mean, until McLean and Ledbetter and a bunch of those guys turned being a golf teacher into a job, that wasn't a job. Teaching golf wasn't not a profession. They made it a profession, right? Hey, you can actually make a living doing this, by the way, right? So as people can say whatever they want about those guys, and I think they're both incredible guys, but if you teach golf for a lesson, you owe thanks to Ledbetter and McLean and Carl Welty and a handful of those guys. Like they made golf instruction a job, right? And fitness became a job as I got older. Obviously, TPI jumped the golf part. I was doing golf long before that, but they made golf fitness a big thing, right? So there are moments in history that industries do it. But yeah, I think all of us need some intrinsic motivation, whether it's proving something to our parents, to ourselves, to, and look, in the end of the day do I think my dad cares? No, I think he just wants me to probably be happy and be able to take care of myself. He probably just didn't want to have to support me for the rest of his life. It was probably his biggest concern, right? Not that I wasn't choosing to be on his path, but he probably just looked at my path as a path that wasn't going to work, right? It's like telling your kid, I'm going to be a country music star, right? Or whatever. It's like, well, odds aren't really good, even though you can sing really well. Right? It's like it's a pretty scary path to go down, or whatever the case may be.
Actor or actress.
Correct, right? So as a parent, you want the best for your kids, and you want them to be safe and secure, and all of those things, right? So, like I said, if I probably look back at it now, I would have probably taken the same position that he did, right? And he probably didn't care whether I made it work or not for the same reasons that I did. He just wanted me to be safe and be able to take care of myself. Where I think my drive came with like, oh, I'm going to show you that not only can I do it, I'm going to crush it, right? Like I'm going to actually prove like this is like a real thing, right? And I've been fortunate enough to kind of somewhat be able to do that on a small scale. But yeah, but you can have that intrinsic to yourself. You don't have to be proving anything to anyone, right? You can prove it to yourself. And that, now that I've made it, I don't have to prove anything to my dad. I think he's proud of me and he's seen the success that I've had. But I still go out there every day and still grind just as hard to try to get better at what I do. I mean, it's not like I've stopped because, okay, well, look, I've trained world number ones and I've had major champions and I've done this and I make a nice living and I can support my family. I don't go, okay, well, I'm good. I still go out there every day and try to be better.
Yeah, it's like it's your foundation to improve yourself. What started you on that path as a 20-year something? The desire, the drive, the fundamental of I want to get better and what can I do to get better? You have not ever given up that
No.
fundamental.
Even when I've checked all the boxes of the things I was trying to prove, I think you learn to enjoy the journey. And I think that that's a big part of it. I love the learning. I just truly enjoy learning, talking to other people in the industry, reading, looking through stuff, trying to solve problems, and it obviously gets a little bit more fun when you get to the level that I'm at, where I can pick up the phone and call a Will Wu or call a Sasha McKenzie or call Chris Como or Mark Blackburn or Mike Adams or whatever, and just say, hey, I was thinking about something. What do you think of this? And just bang ideas off of some of the other smartest minds in different areas. Obviously makes it quite enjoyable, in a lot of ways. People are paying to go to their conferences. I go out to dinner with them, right? So I'm in a situation where it's made it a lot easier to get information. But also, I think what's just technology has allowed us to get access to more good information all the time. And everybody's trying to put out information. In the old days, everything was a secret. Nobody wanted to tell you anything about what they're doing. Now everybody wants to have a podcast, an Instagram account, that show you exactly what they're doing and tell you. I mean, the availability of information, if you know where to look, is endless.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to make sure you're looking at the right people.
Now the problem is, God,
That's the hard part, right?
what
Like being a good filter. Yeah, being a good filter and knowing who you should trust and who you should believe in is the hard part. Because there are people who are great on Instagram who've never actually trained anyone and done anything,
mm-hmm.
or coached anyone and done anything.
Yeah, and
but they got 200,000 followers.
Yeah, no kidding. That's kind of the whole genesis of this show was I knew, I obviously I didn't know you years ago or when I was playing, but it's introduced me to people like you, which has been great learning for me. And as you know, I message you periodically and say, Ben, what do you think of this? Can you help me with this? And Sasha's the same. I've met a whole bunch of people and hopefully, or at least my goal when I started was to give another avenue of information to people that they can be introduced to your information and they can go call you, or they can dig up and they can message you and say, Ben, can I come shadow you for a week or a day or so? And it's very gratifying to me to be able to do so and scratch that curiosity and educational itch that I like to continue to learn new things for myself and for the people I coach.
I think I think outside of performance, when we look at like life of happiness research, like people who get old, the ones who stay happy and don't get defeatist and, blah, 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 one of the things they always correlate is life learners. People are always mentally engaged and learning new things and stimulating their brain in that way is what helps keep cognition going. It keeps, helps with dementia and other mental issues, depression and stuff that people have. And there's a lot of real value outside of the stuff that we're talking about, as far as how you play better golf or whatever the case may be. Just as human beings and your long-term well-being, that being a life learner has a lot of value. And I think that that's an important thing outside of all the things that we're talking, and probably should be a pretty good motivator for most people, because I don't think most of us at the end of our days want to be, laying in a bed depressed and miserable. We'd like to feel like we can stay with our brains sharp, our minds sharp, and our learning and engaged and thought-provoking and all of those things.
Well, as usual, we hit on a lot of stuff, a lot of information today, and I don't think there's anything we haven't, well, I'm sure there's a lot we haven't uncovered or discussed, but that leaves the door open for you to come back again. I hope you'll do so. And I can't thank you enough for coming on. And
yeah, we'll see if you pay my first invoice, and then we'll see how we go from there.
Great. It's been great, Ben. Thank you very much. Everyone, thanks
Awesome,
for tuning
Pete.
in.
I appreciate it, man. Yep. Thanks.